So today I will be sharing my experiences in observing my personal attitudes related to climate action. So as an introduction, my name is Amin and I'm a fourth year psychology student, and my knowledge about climate change is quite limited, let alone the psychology of climate change. And so far in my life, I haven't been very conscious of my contributions to the issue, nor my psychological processing of those contributions. So it is safe to say that the process of observing and analyzing my thought patterns in relation to the climate crisis was quite an interesting and enlightening endeavor. So over the course of 2 weeks, I decided to monitor my consumption habits and relevant thought patterns in relation to my consumption. And I essentially made it a point to pay close attention to my behaviors, and whenever I noticed a particularly negative consumption behavior, I stopped to ask myself why I was doing this and why I was not behaving in a more environmentally friendly manner. Whenever I came up with an answer, I jotted down the answers into my phone's note app. And I ended up with a lengthy, dated analysis of my thoughts in relation to my dietary and transportation routines. I focused on diet and transportation primarily because these choices were most relevant to my own life and decisions, and they were the most common climate related consumption habit I had. In reflection of my thoughts, I focused on three components of my rationalizations for my behavior, and that included habits, conflict of interest, and belief in solutions outside of my own control. In terms of transportation, we all know that it is suggested that we use our vehicles less often and opt for more sustainable alternatives to traveling. I personally drive to both work and to run important errands such as grocery shopping. Accordingly, about 1 week ago, when I came home from grocery shopping, I noticed that I was suddenly craving fast food even though I had the ingredients to prepare my own food at the time. However, I was still adamant to get back into the car and go to a drive-thru. On my way to the car, I realized that this was an unnecessary trip which would only further contribute to my own gas emissions. I knew that this was a trip that was essentially about my own pleasure, so naturally I felt a little bit ashamed. But I brushed it off, and essentially what I told myself in order to let it go was that does not probably contribute so much, and it's okay to just do it for one time. Suddenly my guilt was reduced quite a bit, and I went on with my decision. And so I went on to get the food, and afterwards I began to reflect. I realized that these sort of excuses are likely what could keep a person from acting in ways that are virtuous or necessary. In some ways, it felt like this is exactly how a negative habit could be unknowingly formed. Accordingly, I realized that I also make a lot of other pointless trips without being totally conscious of it. It was suddenly very clear that this is a consistent waste of money and is gradually increasing my emissions. This was a new realization for me, and I felt a sense of enlightenment because I never actually stopped to question this before. I realized that I could stand to reduce car emissions by reducing my car usage to necessary use and by supplementing some of that use with walking and biking more often. After I realized this, I felt somewhat more content and excited to do better. In addition to the formation of habits around transportation, I also noticed that I rationalized my emissions by deferring to a legitimate use of transportation. After I noticed my irresponsibility with unnecessary car trips, I began to question why I should really use a personal vehicle at all. I figured that perhaps I should begin running errands in a carpool or begin biking more often. However, I realized that I am aspiring to get into a career field where that would require constant use of a personal vehicle throughout the day. It doesn't mean that I cannot be conscious of my car emissions for personal use, but in moments of questioning my own irresponsible use in the past couple weeks, I did use this as an excuse to not change my behavior in that moment. It almost felt as though I was telling myself, I'll use the car a lot when I graduate anyway, so why change now? Of course, this is obviously fallacious. But another important aspect of climate action I learned is understanding the contributions of our dietary patterns and purchases. And before my observations began, I had just learned that the meat industry plays a very major role in elevated greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, eating less meat could generate less of an incentive to the industry to continue on with harmful farming methods. And I thought about this quite a bit before eating meals with animal products, which is a significantly important aspect of my lifestyle, rather a core aspect of my lifestyle. I figured that I should change, but once again, I quickly rationalized my own actions. This time, I would tell myself that my eating meat alone doesn't make much of a difference because I'm just one person, and going vegan is not going to necessarily convince others to do so. This is obviously fallacious for multiple reasons. Most importantly, if everybody has that mindset, then nothing could ever change within a society. So it doesn't exactly absolve me of my responsibility to do better. To simply not put as much of my own money into that industry is fully within my own control and could influence others in my life. Overall, it seems to be a common theme that I could come up with very creative excuses for negating climate action. In terms of challenges, the greatest challenge with this task was in maintaining self honesty while assessing my own thought patterns. I think that it's generally very easy to believe in the excuses that you make for yourself. It was a little bit tough to let go of my justifications for my actions and be completely self critical. Perhaps this is based on some sort of natural protection mechanism. I don't know. I'm not sure. But essentially, it appeared that metacognitive analysis from my own perspective was very tough. But what helped to counter the challenge was to journal my own thoughts as I went. This way, I could prompt myself with questions to dissect my own understanding when I read it through later on. And even reading through my journal thoughts later on helped by removing me from the mindset in which I actually had those conflicting thoughts and emotions. And in this sense, hindsight was 2020 because I could look back and see things as a different person, essentially, experiencing it at a different time. So now I will analyze what this experiential process taught me about concepts related to climate action. In terms of risk perception, I learned that I am prone to undermining the risks associated with consumption behaviors. Even though I am aware that there is a threat, it is very easy for me to keep myself from acting as if there is one. Perhaps this is based on social cues that make it seem acceptable, or perhaps this is because the threat appears abstract and out of my control. In terms of barriers, I learned that I am prone to putting up very stubborn psychological blocks to taking on appropriate climate action. Previously, I may not have noticed that such mechanisms play a role in my climate related consumption habits, but I learned that with analysis, we can learn to pay attention to and realize these things, and potentially begin to respond appropriately. For example, I now know how conflict of interest, habits, and feelings of inefficacy play a huge role in maintaining my own negative behaviors. I feel like with this knowledge, I could begin to be more aware and counter them when I encounter the opportunity for climate related action. If we as human beings can create such creative excuses for doing the wrong thing, then maybe countering my own barriers could help me understand the barriers of others and help to challenge it down the line. In terms of impacts, what I have noticed is that it's possible for psychological impacts of climate change to play a role in why perhaps I was emotionally adamant on underestimating my own emissions. For one, it's an issue of guilt. I feel some sense of guilt for not doing the right thing, and I notice this throughout my observations. But my response to this is often to justify myself rather than confront my shortcomings in this area. And in terms of uncertainty, I feel quite uncertain about the effects of the climate crisis because my understanding remains quite vague and hard to wrap my head around. And this assignment reduces some of that uncertainty by allowing me to be more sure of what the issue is and how I can begin to counteract my own contributions. So, in conclusion, this was an interesting opportunity to learn more about myself and to help sow the seeds of positive climate action. This process enlightened me to understand more about what I can do to help quell my contribution to the climate crisis and to mold healthier behaviors by analyzing my own thought patterns. I will be definitely carrying this experience with me moving forward, not only for climate related actions and contributions, but to other aspects of my life where I can stand to implement this sort of helpful self analysis. So, overall, this was a beneficial experience for me. Thank you for paying attention to my presentation.